Welcome to Episode 9 of the Saunders Aircraft Story, titled Saunders Aircraft under Reg Kersey. On March 13, 1972, in an internal MDC memo to the Manitoba Development Corporation Board of Directors, it was discussed the options of winding Saunders Aircraft down and putting Saunders Aircraft into bankruptcy. The memo also stated that the Saunders engineering staff was confident that FAR 25 certification could be attained from the FAA by October 31, 1972 at a maximum cost of $345,000. A third option was also given to the Manitoba Development Corporation Board of Directors, and that was to continue work at Saunders Aircraft and invest an additional $3,535,000. The MDC Board of Directors decided to choose option 3 and continue work with Saunders Aircraft. The sale of ST-27004 to Aces of Columbia was announced on April 10, 1972, and 004 would receive the Certificate of Export from the Canadian government. On June 2, 1972, the Manitoba government announced a major restructuring at Saunders Aircraft. Saunders President William Kelly would be fired by MDC. Thomas Out of Flyer Coach Industries would become Managing Director, and Reg Kersey, Saunders Vice President, would then become the new President of Saunders Aircraft. The announcement of the new Saunders management team coincided with the decision by the Manitoba government to take over control of Saunders Aircraft through the Manitoba Development Corporation, or known as MDC. MDC owned 54% of the Saunders Aircraft shares. Also at this time, Manitoba Minister Len Evans was lobbying Federal Industry Minister Jean-Luc Pepin for federal support for Saunders Aircraft. The Manitoba lobbying was based on federal support to other aviation companies, which included $3.5 million to Bell Aerosystems Canada to develop a large freighter hovercraft, $20 million to Canadair to replace single-seat CF5 fighter aircraft being sold to Venezuela with 20 new CF5 two-seaters, and $15 million for de Havilland Twin Otter STOL program, and $120 million including the purchase of 30 Twin Otters, giving de Havilland Canada enough cash to qualify for a $45 million grant to build and test two prototype DH-7-7 STOL airliners. July 14, 1972 would see the resignation of Arnold Steinberg from the Saunders Board of Directors. Steinberg was one of the original investors in Saunders Aircraft, and also in the Manitoba legislature, Minister Len Evans, during question period, would state that Saunders Aircraft has a 5-year development plan, and at the end of 4 to 5 years, a jet model would be produced by Saunders Aircraft. On July 23, 1972, another first Saunders investor, Stephen Causer, would write Premier Ed Schreyer asking Schreyer to stop the MDC from placing Saunders Aircraft in judicial receivership. The lobbying for federal government funding would continue with an invite to Transport Minister Don Jamieson and Winnipeg MP James Richardson to visit the Saunders plant in Gimli. However, the Jamieson trip got cancelled. July 5th would see the first students of the Canada Manpower Saunders Aircraft Sheet Metal Training School graduate. The men were trained under a $176,000 grant from Canada Manpower. In late July, Reg Kersey would take the ST-27 on a tour of northern Manitoba to demonstrate the ST-27 on gravel runways, in an effort to entice Transair to purchase an ST-27. Saunders Aircraft would be in the news on July 31, 1972, when the Winnipeg Free Press reported that Saunders Managing Director Thomas Out strongly recommended that the Saunders Aircraft plant be moved to Winnipeg over the shortage of skilled workers at Gimli. Industry Minister Len Evans would deny that there was any such demands from Out, and the matter would die. On August 11, 1972, the Manitoba government announced that chartered accountant Sidney Parsons of Winnipeg was appointed as chairman of the Manitoba Development Corporation to replace Dr. Peter Bryant, who was returning to McGill University to teach commerce. Parsons is the owner of Huggard Equipment Company of Winnipeg and graduated from the University of Manitoba in 1950. A Winnipeg Tribune article in October had Provincial Industry Minister Len Evans frustrated that the federal government had reassigned Transport Canada inspectors that were assigned to the Saunders Aircraft Certification Program. Evans would also write to Federal Minister Jean-Luc Pépin that Manitoba was upset with the federal government purchasing 30 de Havilland Canada Twin Otters and not giving any consideration to purchasing any Saunders ST-27 aircraft. In October 1972, Saunders Aircraft would receive the FAA FAR 25 certification ruling through DOT for the all-new ST-27A, also known as the ST-27B. The FAA noted that some of the ATEL engineering analysis on the ST-27 was not in accordance with FAR 25 and that additional testing or analysis would be required. Saunders had thought the engineering analysis done on the de Havilland Heron and the ST-27 would make up most of the engineering data needed for the FAR 25 certification program, but this was proving not to be the case and that new engineering analysis would be required by Saunders Aircraft. December 4th would see Reg Kersey join the Ed Schreyer trade delegation to Moscow for the possibility of selling the ST-27 to the Soviet Union. Also in December, Saunders Aircraft would submit a proposal to MDC to purchase the rights to manufacture the Fairchild Husky. The cost would be $3 million to obtain the rights. The Fairchild Husky was introduced in 1946 by Fairchild Aircraft of Canada, specifically as a bushplane for Canada's north. The Husky faced severe competition from the de Havilland Canada Beaver and Otter. The Husky was found to be underpowered and production stopped in 1948 when Fairchild Industries went bankrupt. Only 12 Huskies were built. In 1955, a firm in British Columbia would revive the Husky under the name of Husky Aircraft Limited and would convert 4 Huskies with a more powerful British Leontide engine. And a proposal to use a PT6 turboprop engine, same engine as used on the ST-27, was proposed but not carried out. In the end, MDC would reject the Saunders Husky proposal. The end of 1972 would see Saunders Aircraft receive CAA approval to use a more powerful PT6-34 engine of 750 horsepower on the ST-27. A January 24, 1973, Winnipeg Free Press classified ad featured paid training at Saunders Aircraft at $2.20 an hour to start for trainees. On February 16, 1973, Manitoba Cabinet Minister Sidney Green was appointed minister responsible for the Manitoba Development Corporation, who now were the majority owners of Saunders Aircraft. Green was first elected to the Manitoba legislature in 1966 and appointed to the cabinet in 1969 in Ed Schreyer's NDP government. Green had graduated from the Manitoba Law School in 1955. Also in February, Manitoba Public Works Minister Russell Doran announced in Gimli that the Gimli Industrial Park was ahead of schedule on the 5-year objective of full occupancy. Then on March 24th, the Financial Post newspaper would publish a scathing article on Saunders Aircraft written by Donald Rumball. The article went on to say how Manitoba may be stuck with a $8.5 million lame goose in Saunders Aircraft. The political opposition in Manitoba were quick to pounce on the NDP government in regards to Saunders Aircraft, which in turn meant that any MDC loans to Saunders Aircraft would come with heavy criticism. Then in turn, the Winnipeg Tribune would run a feature article on April 21, 1973, titled How much more time does Saunders need? So not only were the opposition politicians highly critical of Saunders Aircraft, so were two of the major newspapers. In the Tribune article, Saunders President Reg Kersey went on to say that the 13th ST-27 would come off the assembly line by the end of 1973, the 33rd aircraft by the end of 1974, and production would be at 3 aircraft per month in 1975. The new Saunders ST-27B would be coming into production on January 1974, and the ST-27 would be phased out of production by mid-1974. Lofty goals indeed. On May 7, 1973, Floyd E. Snow from Aviation Technical Services and current Chief Engineer for Saunders Aircraft would submit the ST-27B FAR 25 certification flight test program to the Ministry of Transport for their approval. Around the same time, Saunders placed several ads looking for aircraft quality control inspectors in the Winnipeg daily newspapers. May 21st would see a letter from the FAA concluding the basis for the FAR 25 certification for the ST-27. June 19, 1973 would see aeronautical engineer Lane Helms from Aviation Technical Services in California become involved in the ST-27 certification program. Lane Helms would later become a cornerstone in the Saunders story. Flight International magazine would carry this article on the all-new ST-27A, aka ST-27B, in the June 28 issue of Flight International magazine. Stuart Eddles, Saunders' Vice President of Manufacturing, would present the Saunders update to a July Rotary Winnipeg meeting at the Hotel Fort Garry. Stuart said he expected that Saunders' growth could double Gimli's population to 10,000 people by the end of the decade. July 18, 1973 would see Lane Helms of Aviation Technical Services in California be titled as Chief Engineer of Saunders Aircraft. Also in that month, Saunders would issue a purchase order to Aircraft Tank Service in Burbank, California to rework and metallize elevator, rudder, and aileron assemblies for the ST-27B. On August 3rd, Saunders would receive the official bird strike report on the ST-27B from the National Research Council in Ottawa. Then on November 8, Saunders receives a $996,000 Federal Department of Regional Expansion grant for the launch of the ST-27B program. Saunders' chief engineer Lane Helms and family would relocate from Los Angeles, California to Gimli. Lane Helms grew up on an old order Mennonite farm in Pennsylvania. Helms received his degree in aeronautical engineering from Northrop University in Inglewood, California in 1962. Helms began work in North American aviation on the XB-70 supersonic jet bomber project, then on to Aero Commander Incorporated, then Delmar Engineering, then Ted Smith Aircraft, and on to ATS, Aviation Technical Services, in 1966. Looking to escape the craziness of Los Angeles, Helms accepted the chief engineer position at Saunders Aircraft in 1973. Initially, Helms would commute from Los Angeles to Gimli in his Cessna 182 aircraft before moving the family to Gimli in the fall of 1973 and becoming a lifelong resident of Gimli. December 1973 would see the Colombian airline ACES purchase a third ST-27 aircraft for their operation, thus closing 1973 on a high note for Saunders Aircraft. In early January 1973 would see Thomas Out, the managing director of Saunders Aircraft, fired by the NDP government. This meant that Reg Kersey, current president of Saunders Aircraft, would now be the top man at Saunders Aircraft. St. Andrews Airways, out of the St. Andrews Airport just north of Winnipeg, Manitoba, would lease ST-27 number 006 CF-LOL in late January 1974. St. Andrews Airways was started in 1970 by Ron Mahowchuk of Winnipeg and George Brotherson of Island Lake, and the general manager was Tom Ivey. Their business was flying cargo and passengers from St. Andrews Airport up to Island Lake and neighboring communities. In March, Chief Engineer Lane Helms would submit a proposal to MOT outlining static test frame tests to be done on the ST-27B structure. In mid-March, St. Andrews Airways would fly ST-27-006 to the Saunders plant in Gimli for servicing. While the mechanics were changing the right wing fuel pump, another technician mistakenly turned on the master electrical switch. An electrical spark resulted in a wing fuel tank explosion. Saunders employees Dennis Young and Mel Christensen suffered severe burns and were rushed to hospital. To get ST-27-006 back into service as soon as possible, a new overhauled wing from ST-27-013 under construction was taken off and put on 006. The damaged right wing from 006 would be repaired and later put on 013. On July 19, 1974, Transport Canada was informed that the U.S. FAA personnel would visit the Saunders plant in Gimli on July 16th and 17th to coincide with the scheduled first flight of the ST-27B prototype. In the Saturday, July 12th edition of the Winnipeg Tribune, a half-page article was run whether taxpayer funding of Saunders Aircraft was wise. One can only imagine the turmoil at Saunders Aircraft when these in-depth questioning newspaper articles came out. However, on July 17, 1974, the ST-27B prototype was successfully flown with Saunders President Reg Kersey at the controls. Only the Lake Center newspaper would carry this article 2 weeks later and get the name of the aircraft wrong in the article title. The August issue of the Selkirk Enterprise newspaper would carry a special feature on St. Andrews Airways based out of St. Andrews Airport. The article would go on to say that St. Andrews Airways found the ST-27 aircraft an excellent aircraft for their small airline. In October, Saunders Aircraft announced the sale of an ST-27 aircraft to Ontonabe Airways of Peterborough, Ontario, for operation on their route between Toronto and Montreal via Peterborough. In November, 86% of the Saunders workforce voted in favor of strike action to bring about a wage settlement, and Cabinet Minister responsible for Saunders Aircraft, Sid Green, was lampooned in this Free Press story. To end 1974, Premier Ed Schreyer would offer his opinion on Saunders Aircraft. Schreyer would say that the loans to Saunders Aircraft is a calculated risk to establish an aerospace industry in Manitoba and to bring social and economic relief to Gimli following the closure of the Gimli Air Base. Saunders now employs 520 persons, with 80% living in the Gimli area, and an annual payroll of $4.8 million. Schreyer went on to say that the NDP government was prepared to spend up to $30 million on Saunders Aircraft. Schreyer also noted that the federal government has obligations to Gimli, as solemn assurances were given by the federal government to ensure an alternative industry when the airbase was closed. Schreyer went on to say that the $4 million promised to Saunders by the federal government is peanuts to what the federal government has given to de Havilland and Canadair. This ends Episode 9 of the Saunders Aircraft Story. Episode 10 will be out later this summer. Thank you for watching.